So you're ready to buy a home. That is great. But are you ready to hire and pay for a realtor? In just 5 days, on August 17th, home buyers will be required to enter into a buyer agreement for the representation, and there will be an obligation to pay your broker. There are no exceptions. In today's episode, we're going to deep dive into this paradigm shift of the buyer agreement. We will discuss how the industry we got here, the three most common types of agreements, and the buyer's obligation of compensation to the realtor and how it can be paid. Welcome to the SoFlo Real Estate Show. Ask Athena and Julie anything. My name is Athena Chilicas Barrocas. I am a top producer and award-winning realtor with Coldwell Banker. My co-host Julie Dinda, Radius Financial Group, is here with us today. Remember to subscribe to get notifications of all the episodes. Hey, Julie, welcome to the show. How are you?
Great to be here. We have a very important topic to discuss today.
Oh my gosh, this is so important. It is extremely important. To give you an idea, I hosted an open house this weekend, like I always do every weekend, right? But it was different this time. My dialogue now includes asking a buyer who walks in, if they've entered into a buyer agreement. Totally different than, hi, how are you? We have to know if they've entered into a buyer agreement. But when I shared an overview of what a buyer agreement is, the response of the buyer was first shock and then total dismay. Both shared that they will find some other way of buying a home. But the truth is, there is no other way. As the new mandate, August 17, Julie, all buyers in the United States must enter into a buyer agreement before a realtor can offer a service, whether it's showing a property, opening a door, showing property virtually, or more importantly, submitting an offer for purchase. So, Julie, before we deep dive into this topic, let's talk about the lending industry. Where are we today on buyer paid compensation, and what are we hearing about for the future?
Sure. So we'll say today. So the recent changes requiring that buyer agent compensation needs to be spelled out in contracts. That'll have a significant implication for financing. So whatever it is that is going to be agreed upon, I need to have that contract. So I know that if there's any issues. So as a lender, understanding how these commissions and the seller concessions are structured, it's crucial because they directly impact the buyer's loan qualifications. So if it's not carefully managed, these fees could push a buyer's debt to income ratio above those acceptable limits, jeopardizing their ability to actually secure a mortgage. Now, the future is unknown. Reluctance will become routine. So the shift, essentially the shift towards that transparency and the requirement for written agreements before the home tours reflects a broader industry trend towards formalizing and standardizing those real estate transactions. So this change can lead to a more predictable, smoother financing process as all parties involved will have a clear understanding of the financial commitments from the outset.
Thank you, Julie. Thanks for sharing. Buyers will be asking this question, especially when it comes to loan approvals, how this affects their loan approval, what transpires, because we really won't know until the very end where the buyer is in their debt to income ratio until they finalize a purchase agreement. So having that conversation, that transparency with the lender up front is so important. So it's good to have this dialogue, Julie. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So let's review a few highlights to remind our audience how we got here today in this discussion. So Julie, why don't you kick it off with a little bit of history?
So in 2019, a group of Missouri home sellers filed a class action lawsuit against the National Association of Realtors. They were claiming antitrust violations and alleging that the association's practices inflated commissions. So this change will go into effect August 17th, 2024, the settlement payment. So the NAR, which is the National Association of Realtors, would pay $418 million for approximately 4 years.
That's big money, Julie,
Big
big
money.
money. But under the proposed terms, this is incredibly important. Realtor members serving as buyer agents will need to enter into written agreements with buyers before offering services such as property showings or submitting offers. And this agreement does include a buyer obligation of compensation to the realtor. This is where the paradigm shift is coming into. The settlement is still subject to final court approval on November 26th of this year. Nobody is expecting anything to come out of that other than the full approval.
Yeah, it's true. It's a paradigm shift for sure. What comes to mind is the brave new world. Today, it is the brave new world of real estate.
Oh my gosh, it is the brave new world. But we've seen this type of change, this paradigm shift in other industries. We've seen it in the travel industry. We've seen this paradigm shift. And as your point from earlier today, Julie, it takes time. It takes people to create models. It takes procedures. It takes policy. So we're all going to be somewhat in this influx of unknown for a little while.
Correct. Yeah.
But let's move on to the different types of buyer agreements. There's many types of buyer agreements out there, depending on the situation, depending on the parties, depending on a lot of things. But there's three agreements that I feel personally that after 21 years of business, that these are going to be the three most common types of agreements. So that's a big change for us. So the first agreement I'd like to talk to is really called for Coldwell Banker, it's called the market area representation agreement. And this agreement is, let me just find my notes for a moment. This agreement, a buyer has an exclusive right to represent him or her in the purchase of a home in a certain market area. So a market area can be a community, it can be a city, it can be a county, it can even be the state of Florida, for example. And there is an offer of compensation, and all compensation is negotiable. And then there's other terms around this particular buyer representation agreement.
So this is a great example of a buyer who is looking for a home but cannot decide where they want to live. So a buyer can be looking into the cities of, let's say, Weston, Dayton, Plantation, and Orlando. It would be in the best interest to have two agreements, one for each of those unique market areas.
Yeah, absolutely, Julie. I mean, that is a perfect example. You have one realtor with the expertise in one area, but you're looking for, possibility of relocating to a different area, maybe a second home, maybe a vacation home, maybe an investment property that's outside of the particular market area. You're going to need representation. It's great to have a market representation for both. So, great idea. And this agreement can be considered for long-term relationships as well. The buyer, the realtor, they know each other, they're comfortable with each other, they trust the relationship. This is a perfect way of forming a contractual relationship. Another one is the buyer representation agreement. This is when a buyer agrees that the broker will have exclusive right to represent him or her in the purchase of what we call a covered property. The first one was an area. This is a property, a covered property. A covered property is any property shown virtually or in person. The offer of compensation, of course, is negotiable, and there's other terms as well.
So let me offer an example. So if I'm interested in seeing homes in one specific community and I don't know the agent well enough to enter into a more comprehensive buyer agreement, this is a great way to begin the relationship.
It's an excellent way to begin the relationship because it gives you an opportunity to say, you know what, I only want to be in this relationship for maybe 2 weeks, a month. right? You can make it a very concise period of time. Get to know each other. Does the realtor want to work with the client? Does the client want to work with the realtor? And those covered properties, so remember, those covered properties remain the agreement whether or not the two decide to continue to work together for a period of time. And so that's what the buyer broker agreement is. The last one I want to talk about, which I think we're going to see quite a bit, is called the single property representation agreement. This is very nice, Julie. We were talking earlier about, showing properties. A lot of times somebody will call and say, hey, I want to see a property at 123 Main Street. And the agent would go and take them to 123 Main Street. Under today's mandate, the agent cannot just take you to see 123 mandate and 123 Main Street. You must sign a document that shows representation with that agent. So Julie, now we can say, sure, we'll take you to 123 Main Street, but you need to sign the single property representation agreement and we'll write 123 Main Street. So this is a great document for maybe an open house, for somebody who walks into a real estate office, a one time only. There's offer of compensation on this agreement, which is negotiable, and there's other terms.
Okay, so the buyer calls an agent is showing the specific home only.
Exactly, one home. That's it. And if they decide they want to see two or three, the agreement can encompass that as well. So there's a lot of flexibility in these agreements. It's not so restrictive. The restrictive part is you have to have an agreement. Are there agreements that fit different scenarios? Yes, there are. But here's another example, Julie, and I know you'll appreciate this one. For the single property showing, a lot of times buyers are calling up the listing agent, right? Hey, I want to see your listing at, 123 Main Street. The agent would be able to show them that without any issues, of course. Now the agent will have to get that one-time property showing agreement in order to show, because now that agent is the possibility of becoming buyer's agent, not just a listing agent.
Oh wow, that's crazy to think. So now even if they are listing the property, they can't just show it. They still have to go into a buyer agreement.
For a one-time property showing. Absolutely. So there's another example of the paradigm shift. There's a lot of nuances that we have to kind of look out for.
Okay.
So let's move on to compensation. This is going to be a very different approach in the market. I know the audience is going, okay, I got the relationship part, but the compensation, me, a buyer, need to pay compensation? This is crazy. It's very different. And so, Julie, prior to the settlement, remind us how realtors were paid.
Both the listing broker and the buyer's agent. I'm sorry. Essentially, the listing broker and the buyer's broker were paid from the seller proceeds that will be closing on the home.
That's right. Yeah, you got it. A little tongue-tied there. I was tongue-tied earlier today, so it's okay. But you're right. Both the listing agent and listing broker and the buyer's broker were both paid from the seller proceeds at the time of closing. Effective August 17th, the obligation of compensation to the buyer broker will be paid by the buyer. Very, very different. So let's talk about this. What are the three ways a buyer broker compensation can be paid? Well, the first one would be great. The seller pays for it. Still possible after August 17th. Second way, both the seller and buyer combined pay for the compensation. Third, the buyer pays the compensation. Totally different. The realtor, per the buyer's instructions, may also negotiate the buyer's obligation of compensation as part of the submission. So that gives a little bit more leeway for the buyer to further engage in the process.
So let me run a scenario. So if a buyer enters into a contract to purchase a home for, let's say, $800,000, and the negotiated compensation to the buyer broker is 3%, then the buyer's obligation is $24,000.
Okay, Julie, yes, your math is correct. It would be $24,000. I know, sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. But let's run this scenario that is actually a little bit more complicated than simple math. Let's talk a little bit more about the compensation and how these different scenarios can possibly play out. So the seller may be offering a compensation on your property at 123 Main Street for 2%. So that's $16,000 the seller has already agreed to pay. This leaves a 1% gap. Now, what do we do at this point? Well, the buyer can instruct the buyer agent to submit their offer to purchase, including the 1% commission to be paid by the seller. And what comes back? If yes, great. The buyer has their obligation of compensation fully satisfied. If no, then the buyer can decide whether or not they want to contribute the 1%, or they can decide to look at a different property. So those are the ways that the compensation would work and how the compensation can be paid by different parties.
So there's more options for the buyer for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, about 94% of buyers are represented by a buyer's agent. A buyer's agent has a significant role in guiding a buyer through the complexities of a home buying process. Nobody else is as good as a buyer's broker. And, I just don't see that the role is going to diminish anytime soon.
And it really is a different world for everyone who's associated with the real estate transaction. So especially the buyer and the realtor. So with your 21 years of experience, what is your advice to our audience?
Oh, great question. Big topic. I know what my number one advice is, Julie. Before anyone decides to sign a representation agreement, whether you're at an open house, whether you walk into a brokerage, whether you meet a realtor to see a home at a particular address, no. First thing you want to do is meet with the realtor at their office to ensure that you are hiring the best realtor for your needs and your personality. Understanding the process of home buying. It's a brave new world. Effective August 17th. Thank you, Julie. I'm going to remember that. So don't sign a representation agreement until you fully understand all of the terms and all of the implications. Julie, knowing what we know today, what is your advice?
I think that it's like it's new, and I think that just like everything else, it'll adjust. So we'll adjust, the lenders will adjust, the title companies are going to adjust. I know personally I use a lot, especially for my first time home buyers, I use a lot of down payment assistance programs, and these are going to be more important than ever. So especially as buyers may now be responsible for directly paying that agent commission, these programs can provide essential support to first-time home buyers. Maybe it's helping them cover their additional clothing costs, like their agent fees, without compromising that loan eligibility.
Thank you, Julie. That is great advice. So if you're a home buyer and you want to learn more about the buyer agreements, be sure to schedule an appointment with a realtor you trust. If you'd like Julie or myself to answer any of your questions, simply book an appointment. We would love to hear from you. Remember to like and subscribe. See you next week, Julie.
Bye. See you next week.